Welcome to the Psych Ward Podcast, where we have conversations with everyday people about men. We believe that every man has an authentic version of himself, so we're on a mission. And that mission is to find an answer to one question. What does it mean to be a man? Welcome back to the Psych Ward Podcast, where we have authentic conversations about men with men. Mike, how are you today?
I'm doing good, thanks.
Good. I am Dr. Eric Ward. Today, we are going to try to answer the question, what is so bad about being traditionally male? Seems more and more as our society changes that traditional men are in many ways being told that it's time to shut up and sit down, that their time has passed. They've done enough damage and they can be quiet. We keep hearing terms like toxic masculinity or men being accused of being misogynistic for being what I think many of them think is just being a man. Harmful masculinity obviously is a thing. We know that there are men out there who are truly toxic in their role as men, and we see it. We see it in things like sexual assault, domestic violence, homophobia, and all of the behavior that comes with that. But I think, Mike, what's really missing from this conversation is what it means to have a healthy expression of masculinity. It's really interesting. I came across a study as I was preparing for today's podcast just a few years ago, back in 2020, some place called the Mentorship Institute.
Never heard of it.
And they've probably never heard of us either. But they conducted a qualitative research project, multiple countries, actually. The United States, UK, France, Germany, Austria, even Jordan in the Middle East. They interviewed hundreds of men from, it sounds like, all different age groups and backgrounds. And I won't bore you with all of the details and all of the numbers, but just a couple of quick takeaways from the study. One of the things that they said was that masculinity and manhood are essentially in crisis. And they related that to longstanding structures and stereotypes about men and about men in society being evaluated and changed. They also talked in the study results about the old school masculine stereotypes, being aggressive, privileged, being a tough man, that while those were hypersexual and unemotional, those as well are being dismantled. So I think overall, we can't really argue that the concept of the conventional man's man, so to speak, is in many ways being pushed to the side and maybe even done away with as our culture changes and progresses. And that kind of leads us to today's question. So, Mike, what is so wrong about being conventionally male?
Yeah, good question. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with it. I've been thinking about what makes men unique, and one of the things that keeps popping up is the biological drive to procreate, and all of the problems that can bring to a relationship, especially. But I think it's misunderstood by both men and women, and that both men and women can do better to understand what that drive actually means and what they can do better to deal with that drive. When I was an undergrad, I was in anthropology class, and they taught us all about male sex drive as it relates to we were talking about primates at the time. The stereotype is that all men think about all the time is sex. And I know in one of your books you talk about that. And I don't think we prepare young men and women for this. I didn't learn the psychobiological piece of this until college, and high school. Junior high is probably when people should be learning about this.
Yeah, you see it in some pretty negative stereotypes, right? When a guy sleeps with lots of women, he's a champion. When a woman sleeps with lots of men, she's a slut. It's all negative versus positive for men. It is funny. You talk about thinking about sex, all day, every day. The book that you're referring to, What to Expect When Adopting a Guy. I did actually the first chapter in that book because I knew it was going to come up. I knew it was one of those things that I think women believe about men is that's all we think about is sex all times a day. And I talk about this statistic that you hear all the time that men think about sex every, I think, 7 seconds or 8 seconds, whatever the number is. And while we certainly do think about sex more than women, the data backs that up. And I think anecdotally, any one of us would agree with that. I've been married for coming up on 25 years. I can definitely tell you that I think about sex more than my wife does. But it's maybe not so often. I mean, that would be thousands of times a day, and we wouldn't get anything else done. If that's all we did was think about sex, we wouldn't be able to drive cars. We wouldn't get anything done at work. It looks like for especially the younger generation, it's somewhere around 8 to 10 times a day, as opposed to thousands and thousands that they actually have concrete thoughts about sex.
I wonder why it's different for the younger generations.
So the numbers actually go down as we get older, even for men. Certainly the ratios stay very similar. One of the things I've talked about this before, that dating is essentially a sales game, right? We're selling ourselves to potential partners, whether it's for marriage or long-term relationships, whatever the case may be. And I think because of the male-female dynamic, and you talk about men chasing women, right? That's part of that game. It's part of that, whatever you want to call it, that we're the ones who are doing the pursuing. And often that pursuit looks like the pursuit of sex. And for women, from a sales perspective, I guess for many women, especially in today's culture and society, the product that they're selling is sex. That's what they're offering, and they're trying to get us to buy and pay the highest price possible, I guess. So I don't know if, that's part of the reason after marriage or after a long-term commitment, why even the thought about sex goes down so much for everybody, but it certainly does.
Well, I think biologically the drive goes down too. I've said this to my partner. It's almost like a freedom from that drive that as I get older, I don't have that on my brain so often. It feels really it's very freeing and empowering to not have that picking at me all day. Like, maybe if I do the dishes, I'll get sex tonight. Or maybe if I take her out to dinner, I'll get, all these like games I would play in my head to try to make sure that would happen. It's really, as I get older, that I can tell it's a biological drive that's diminished and actually feels pretty good. In anthropology class, we even learned that the female body is designed to attract a male,
right? Not
just in humans, but any animal. And no wonder that guys are chasing women around, because they're made that way, even in the wild. So to me, that sex drive has been something that it's just always been a part of being a male for me. When I was young, I thought it was, being muscular, being athletic, being, having a strong jawline. To me, that was all manly stuff. And then I realized at some point, well, yeah, personality plays a pretty big role. And so then I kind of modified it to think, well, you got to have a good personality. You have to be attractive. Being attractive as a skinny little rock and roll kid wasn't really something I thought of myself as being attractive or having a very good personality.
For us non-musicians, Mike, the guitar, unfortunately for us, made you more attractive to women. So you could be small and skinny all you want, but
yeah,
you had an unfair advantage.
I did. And it might be partly why I chose to pursue that. But yeah, so as I got older, I realized, it's not really necessarily about strong jawlines and big muscles, because I have neither one of those. But I've actually been able to attract, women. So, and my personality isn't nearly as strange as I thought it was. At least that's what I've been told. You kind of learn as you grow. It's like there's a much broader definition for it, I think.
You talked just a minute ago about the female body being designed to attract men, and I agree. And I think it goes even further than that. As you look back through history on what kind of women were attractive at the time, right? You even go back to the Rubenesque women who were kind of chubby and rounded all over the place. And those were considered the most attractive women. And there were social reasons for it, right? That the vast majority of women actually didn't have access to enough food to become that chubby. And so if you were a little bit overweight, and I can't even remember what movie, but the line was, fat in all the right places, then you were actually one of the successful, desirable women during that time.
Yeah.
And you look, I saw, I remember a couple of days ago, I saw a meme online, and it was two different pictures of the actress, Kristen Stewart. And the first one was several years ago when, long blonde hair and wearing a nice dress. And of course it was low cut and all the makeup. And then it was side by side with a picture of her now, and, short, sort of chopped hair, sort of baggy clothing, no makeup really to speak of. And the text, I don't remember exactly what it said, but the text was essentially, this is, the difference between what's attractive to men and what's not. And I think there's some truth to that. Women certainly are judged as attractive or not based on their appearance in our culture, even by other women. And for us, I think there's a lot more than just our attractiveness. Obviously, that's part of the picture, right?
Right.
Are we in good shape? Are we muscular? Are we tall? Are we all of those things that are considered traditionally attractive for men? But I also think it comes down to, sexuality and strength and, control, whether it's control in situations, control over our own lives, control over other people, I think can be attractive to some women. Are we healthy? Are we resilient as men and as individuals? And that resilience piece, it's interesting because men are often criticized by women for not being emotional. We don't express our emotions. And I would argue that what we really do is we control and manage our emotions, and in particular, the expression of them, or at least healthy men do. And so it's not about being unemotional as much as it is about being controlled emotionally. And of course, like anything, that's on a spectrum and can go too far.
Yeah, and then sometimes it's not healthy because you've been taught not to show any emotion or share your emotions. So yeah, it can be a strength or a problem.
And I think it's one of the things that can lead to being an unhealthy man. I think there are in many ways, some crisis factors from a health perspective about being male. For example, we know that men are upwards of 7 times more likely to commit suicide, and not attempt, but to successfully commit suicide. You look at work cultures, and while I think it's changing a little bit, I think most work cultures tend to be very, very masculine, mostly due to the fact that men are dominant in the working world. I think in most businesses, men still hold the majority of leadership positions, and women who want to be successful, who want to move up the ladder, in some ways have to adopt those traditionally male characteristics.
Right.
They have to be good at conflict. They have to be competitive. They have to be confident, like we talked about last time. And women are not traditionally trained socially to be confident. They have to be emotionally reserved. Otherwise, they're accused of, being out of control or whatever the term is that's applied. And then you look at some of the more obvious health crises that come with being too far down the spectrum on being stereotypically male. Domestic violence. We know that 85% of domestic violence victims are women, which is a huge, huge percentage. And there are men who are victims of domestic violence, but it's considerably smaller. And even you take, for example, to take that domestic violence thing, I saw this statistic that said between 2001 and 2012, just under 6,500 U.S. troops were killed in either Iraq or Afghanistan.
Wow.
So 6,500.
Wow.
During that same time frame from 2001 to 2012, almost 12,000 women were killed by current or ex-partners.
Oh, wow.
It was literally more dangerous to be in a relationship in the U.S. than it was to be at war in Iraq or Afghanistan.
Wow. That's pretty scary.
Right. So, going back to our question, what's so bad about being traditionally male? I think some of the obvious things really come down to when we take that too far, when we believe that being male gives us a certain right or a certain authority or power, especially in our relationships, whether it's work relationships or romantic partners.
Yeah. And going back, if you talk about the sex part, and I keep bringing that back because there's definitely a difference in biological drive for men and women. And it's the behaviors around the sex drive that on both sides. So traditionally or stereotypically, you hear the wife complain all he ever wants to do is have sex, and but then you hear the husband say, "Oh, she's always trying to avoid me," and it's those behaviors that cause the problem. It's the avoidance. It's the shaming. When you shame somebody for their sex drive, it's no different from shaming somebody for their hunger drive. It's biology. So shaming somebody about that is not going to be the answer.
Well, let me ask. What you've said the phrase negative behaviors surrounding sex.
Yes.
Can you give some more examples of what you mean?
Okay. So yeah, pouting. A lot of times the man will initiate sex, get turned down, and for good reasons. Whatever the reasons are, they're usually good reasons. Headache, even though they become stereotypical excuses, they're actually real. And so the guy will pout. It may be even worse than pout. This is where the power and control starts to be a problem. Men with abusive qualities are going to take it even a step further. They're probably going to start yelling. They may even get physical at some point and not just initiate, but just have sex with the wife. The behaviors on the other side are avoidance behaviors, not allowing any sort of touch. So if the woman feels touch is going to lead to sex every time, then there's some avoidance. The woman may avoid hugs, may avoid any kind of touch, because then the man is like, green light. So all those types of behaviors.
Massages in particular.
Yeah, that would be one of them. But the thing is all this stuff could be dealt with earlier in a man or woman's life. So had I learned, my sex education included like 5th or 7th grade health class where they talked about the actual sexual act itself. That didn't help me with any of the behavior stuff. And then my mom gave me a book when I was in high school to read that was all about the male reproductive system and how to have sex. So it was all this how-to stuff. Instead of just because you have the drive doesn't mean that you're entitled to have sex whenever you want. So all of the behavioral pieces that cause the most problems in a marriage or partnership weren't ever taught to me. I think instead of just a how-to course and kind of a health class kind of course in sex education, there could be better education on what behaviors young men, given their strong sexual urges, rather than just saying, abstinence is the only way to handle this, because that's not going to work. That causes a whole set of other behaviors. So anyway,
So I think there's a flip side to that too, though.
what's that?
There are two parties in this trying to initiate sex process. There's a statistic out there, and it's actually been replicated that says that women are more likely, statistically more likely, to initiate divorces than they are sex in their relationship. And that's an extreme statistic. But along the same lines, there's data that says that women are more likely to initiate conflict or arguments in the relationship than they are sex. So if you count up, I guess, for most couples, for lack of a better description, they start fights more than they start sex.
That's an interesting statistic. So they initiate divorce more often than they initiate sex?
That's what the research says, that they're much more likely to initiate a divorce or an end to the relationship than they are to initiate sex, which seems unlikely to me. That's an odd statistic.
But I wonder if it's a kind of response to those behaviors I'm talking about, like relentless pursuit of sex, pouting, physical and emotional abuse, all of those. I wonder if it's a response to that. The actual pulling away from any sort of, especially initiating sex, could be a response to the overwhelming male sex drive.
I think it can. I do think one of the things that you said that really kind of, I guess, touched a nerve for me was, that when we use touch to try and all forms of touch or touch that only leads to sex. And, I made a joke about massage, but I know that even in my own marriage, there have been times where my wife has started conversations with me about the fact that, the only time I ever want to cuddle or snuggle is when I want it to lead to sex, or, that X, Y, and Z behavior are always sort of precursors to sex in our relationship. And she's not wrong. I think there have been times in our relationship where that's absolutely been the case. I think for me, the frustration really comes with that push and pull in the relationship. Like you said, we're sort of the natural pursuers when it comes to sex. And so we pursue and we pursue and we get shot down and we get shot down. And then comes all of the negative behavior.
Yep.
And what's interesting is I think a lot of men would tell you, maybe on the surface of things, they don't like being the ones who always initiate sex, right? Well, why can't she do it? Why can't she once in a while be the one? And frankly, I don't think most men would care one bit about that if they were more successful more often. And maybe they would, but I think really the real issue for most men comes down to I think a lot of times they don't feel like they're initiating. I think they feel like they're begging.
Yeah.
And I don't want to be a beggar in my relationship. I don't want to beg for time. I don't want to beg for attention. I don't want to beg for positive feelings. And I don't want to beg for sex.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think there's such a core difference in being an initiator versus a beggar. And it really, to me, comes down to a mindset thing, right?
Yeah.
An initiator is a leader, right? An initiator is like, hey, I'm the one that gets things done. I'm the one who makes things happen. Being a beggar feels way too much like being an overtired 6-year-old begging for an ice cream cone. I don't want that to be the dynamic my wife and I have. Well, I don't beg.
That's a good example of why I think women can really be turned off. If you're the type that's going to beg for sex, that flies in the face of women are looking for a provider. They're looking for somebody who's, a leader. They're not looking for a 6-year-old. And I think that's one of those behaviors. That's a good example of what I was talking about behaviorally, whether it's pouting or begging, that can really turn somebody off, like pretty strongly, enough that they might say, you know what, this guy is not what I thought he was. He's not the strong leader traditional male guy that I thought he was. Even in primates, that's what the females are looking for. Somebody who's going to provide, somebody who's going to be the top gorilla in this case, silverback, and a begging adult or a pouting adult is not that.
It's interesting because that same study, one of the most interesting pieces of data that I read when I was looking at it, they were talking about couples where both the man and the woman work outside of the home, and with the expectation being that the woman's not home, she's not doing all of the traditionally domestic tasks that she would do if she was staying at home. And so the man had to pick up his fair share. And of course, that has been the source of fights and arguments and disagreements in millions of marriages. But the interesting piece was for those relationships where the man actually did his fair share, going back to that 50-50 split that you mentioned last time, when the man actually did his share, the women, on average, reported being less attracted to their partner who's at home doing some of these tasks, some of these what they described as traditionally feminine tasks.
Wow.
So it feels like a little bit of a lose-lose proposition, right? We're not supposed to be the aggressor. We're not supposed to hold to these traditional male values. But at the same time, if we don't, then our wives or partners find us less attractive. Feels like a loss to me.
Yeah, that is some interesting data.
And they said kind of the same thing for in the women who were in relationships where their men showed, again, what have been sort of stereotypically female characteristics, but showing emotional vulnerability. They said that it for the women, it created apprehension and disapproval on their part. That the women have always said, some women have always said, I want my man to be more emotionally expressive, more emotionally open and vulnerable. But when they do, right, it makes women uncomfortable. It makes them feel apprehensive, and it makes them disapprove of their partners.
That's confusing.
Right.
Now, here's something that kind of, I've seen this in real life where I had a boss and she openly admitted that she could not handle when men were emotional. And when I'm saying men, it's the people that reported to her, not partners, but, employees. So I had a coworker. We both reported to her. He was kind of a highly emotional kind of guy. And I could tell, she didn't even have to tell me. I could tell that she saw that as a weakness. And she treated him a lot worse than she treated me or other men who didn't show that level of emotionality. So that actually kind of illustrates what you're just saying.
Well, hopefully you didn't tell her that you like to shop for candles.
I don't think I did. I think I knew better.
It's interesting because I think for those men, I asked the question last time, can I, as a traditional or conventional man, can I truly be authentic? And I think it's a question I've thought a lot about since then.
Yeah.
And I don't know that I have an answer yet. But one of the things, have you ever heard the term the Atlas complex in men?
I've heard it. I'm not sure what it is.
So it's this idea that as men, we sort of carry the weight of the world on our shoulders, and the world will collapse around us and everyone else if we don't continue to do that. And I think on a lesser level, maybe a softer version of that is the expectation that we have to be tough protectors and providers to our family. So it's that, that book Atlas Shrugged, right?
I was going to ask if that's where that was from. Yeah.
Yeah. This picture of Atlas, kind of holding the world on his shoulders. And if he drops the ball being, Earth, then everything will collapse around us. And what's interesting is, again, going back to that study, a lot of the men in the study and women reported that they believe that this, what we now, I guess, are thinking of as old fashioned, but this older idea that masculinity being tough and aggressive and protective, while also being hypersexual and physically attractive, that whole concept is still strongly present in our society.
Yeah.
The first thing that popped through my head when I read that was, yeah, we saw that in 2016 when they all came out of the woodwork to vote when Hillary Clinton called them all despicable, right?
Yeah.
I think they said, yeah, we're still here and we're not going anywhere. But this concept, whether you take that sort of steroid-driven version of, it's my job to carry the weight of the world on my shoulders, or even the softer version, that it's my job to be tough and to protect and provide. I think there's a lot of pressure that men put on themselves when they take on that role, and all the pieces that come with it. I think it affects their relationships at home and at work, among their friends. I really think that one of the good things, I guess, that's coming from redefining masculinity in today's culture, and I'll tell you, and it won't surprise you, I don't think there are a lot of good things that are coming out of it. But one of the good things I think that's coming out of it is that we're not only looking at the role of men, but we're looking at the role of women, both in a relationship and in a family setting. I think there are some challenges that are coming even from that. There was a book that I read, and it was kind of toward the end of the worst of the worst in the COVID pandemic. And it was written by a psychiatrist out in California, and he primarily works with children and adolescents. And the whole point of his book was that this entire cultural response, which he saw as highly negative and destructive, but this entire cultural response to COVID was driven by women, and it was driven out of fear. And he went all the way back to the 70s, to the beginning of the feminist movement. And he makes this argument that the feminist movement has created a culture, at least in the US, of anxious women. And his rationale for that was that, women, we began telling women as society that you don't need a man. And if you need a man, there's something wrong with you. You need to be strong. You need to do it all yourself. And the reality is, I can't speak for you, but I need my wife. I need her in a lot of different ways. And it's not just sexual. I need my wife emotionally. I need my wife physically. I need my wife spiritually. I need her as a parent. I need her in a lot of different ways. And I think the same is true for women. And when we started telling women, you have to be able to do everything on your own, that there's something inherently broken in you if you need a man, we put this sort of unspoken pressure on them to do something that they couldn't do. And I think they knew they couldn't do it. They recognized that they weren't doing it, and they became anxious.
Yeah.
And the psychiatrist talks about how, these moms just screaming at him about, placing their children at risk and being unsafe, and how, it was unreasonable, and how they were, wouldn't even bring their children into the office, let alone, in masks or anything else, because something might go wrong. And he used it as one example. But I think we've changed the dynamic, and I think women changed their dynamic first. And now men are being told we have to change ours.
Wow. So in therapy, do you see that the dynamic has changed when you work with couples, as far as, and I know every couple's different, but I was thinking about this earlier, was how do we know whether we need to work on what the male is doing in the relationship or the female in a relationship? How do we suss that out as clinicians? And I have my thoughts on it, but I'm curious to see if you've seen a difference over the years.
I think
In the way you target it.
Sure. I think you hit the nail on the head when you said every relationship is different. I've worked with couples where the man is acting like a traditional man and the wife doesn't like it. And it's funny because his argument is usually, I haven't changed one bit since we got married. I'm the same guy I was when we were dating.
Yeah.
But the nature of the relationship, or at least her expectations of it, seem to have changed. I've more frequently seen couples in therapy where the man is not meeting his traditionally male roles. Often he is not going to work. I cannot tell you how many couples I've seen in therapy where the man lost a job and is just in no hurry to go back and get one.
Wow.
Or he doesn't work enough, or he doesn't provide for the family adequately, or at least by her definition of adequate. Or there's some other, maybe stereotypically male obligation or male role that he's not living up to, and that's creating havoc in the relationship.
Interesting.
Your thoughts on it?
To me, it's never a male versus female kind of thing. I haven't had it nearly as many sessions as you have with couples, but the ones that I've had, some of them weren't couples therapy. It was more, I was working with the guy. But a lot of times I will sort of target the communication first and see where, is it a communication issue? And oftentimes it is. I can think of one guy I worked with, actually more than one, where the communication was more of an issue, meaning how he presented problems to the wife. So, for instance, very few I statements. We know that I statements generally work better than if you come at somebody and attack them for what they're doing or not doing. I target the communication between the couple. If I'm only working with the male or the female, it's a little harder. But when you've got the couple there, you can kind of watch and see how they communicate, and you can call them on it with their partner there. So to me, it doesn't always go male versus female, if that makes sense.
It does. I think as a relationship counselor, relationships break down for a lot of different reasons. I'm not your typical couples counselor. I tell couples when I start working with them, we're not going to hug. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about your feelings. We're not going to dig into your past. Obviously we'll dig a little bit, but I tend to focus on where did this relationship break down, and what do we need to learn or relearn to get it back where it needs to be. I always tell new clinicians, one of the things that drives me crazy about couples, every couple I think I've ever worked with has said some version of the same thing. And they all say, I want to go back to how it was when we first got married. And my response is always, why? Why would you want to go back there? Because the road from there leads right here.
Yeah.
And here sucks.
Yeah.
Why do you want to come back here? So I don't know that I take a traditional approach to couples. I had one session, I had a couple that would not stop screaming at each other.
Wow.
They just wouldn't stop. And it didn't matter what I did. They came in and they wanted to argue and they wanted me to referee their arguments. And I told them from day one, I'm not going to do that. But they wouldn't stop. And so I think we were probably in the third session and they were just sitting. I fit the stereotype. I have a couch in my office, so I'm sorry. But they were sitting on the couch and screaming at each other. And I just got up and I turned around and I walked back to my desk and I started doing emails. And it took a minute for them to realize I wasn't even sitting there anymore.
Oh, man, that's funny.
And they kind of stopped and they looked at me and I was like, what? And they're like, well, what are you doing? And I'm like, well, you don't need me for this. You guys are really good at this. So I'm going to be over here. Let me know when you're done. And thankfully it worked, right? It got them to kind of stop screaming at each other. But my whole philosophical approach on relationship counseling really starts with the concept of intimacy, right? And I don't mean sexual or physical intimacy. I mean emotional intimacy. And I won't walk through the whole lecture or explanation that I give couples about that, but it really comes down to this. It's knowledge.
Yeah.
We become intimate when we know each other. We know what the other person wants and how we can meet those needs. And we lose that over time. And I go back to that couple I was talking about a few minutes ago, the couple where, that he says, I'm the same person that I was. And the reality is he's not, right? He may have the same core beliefs and the same core values, especially when it comes to male-female interactions, but he's changed.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so is she. And that's why every couple sits in my office and says, I feel like I don't know this other person anymore. Because you don't.
Different person. Yep.
And you stopped being curious. You stopped learning.
Yep.
So let's try to wrap this up. Going back to our question, what's so bad about being male? I think my last thought about that is that it's important to differentiate between being male, maybe traditionally masculine, traditionally male, and being, and I hate using this phrase because I think it's so overused, but being toxically male.
Yep.
I think, toxic masculinity has really been ascribed in some ways to what is just plain masculinity nowadays. And when I look at what does it mean to be masculine, what does it mean to be a real man? I come down to really kind of a handful of things. One has to do with accountability. I think real men are responsible. I think they're leaders. I think they're accountable to themselves and to their partners. I think real men are respectful, and I also think they are people who honor. They honor themselves. They honor their partners. They honor others. I always tell people I've lost both of my parents. My mom died young, and I've always had this belief that part of my job as a man and as their son is to honor them in who I am and how I comport myself and what I say and what I do.
Mm-hmm.
And I've done well at that sometimes, and I've failed miserably at other times. Another part, I think, of being a real man, it goes back to that emotional resilience. I think, the lack of resilience, emotional resilience, is destroying our society right now. And I won't get into this in depth right now, but I think it's the number one factor for why we see such high suicide rates, particularly in children and adolescents. I think real men work hard. I think they're dedicated to their jobs. I think they're dedicated to being providers. And I also think real men are decision makers. That same book that we referenced earlier, one of the things I get into is the brain science behind how men and women work. One of the things my wife will tell you is that one thing she appreciates and respects about me is that she sometimes struggles to make final decisions. She will, look into things. She'll gather information. She'll toss things around. She'll think about it. And at some point, she'll turn it over to me to make a decision because she knows that that's how my mind works. And what's funny is that is such a stereotype of how men and women's brains are wired. As men, we are wired to be decision makers. We are wired to be linear thinkers. We go in a straight line when it comes to getting to a final decision, whereas women tend to hop all over. And from a brain science perspective, they're tapping into multiple regions of their brain for data recall and relationship information and connectivity between data points. And that's why I think sometimes they get stuck. And so I think that's my last piece is that a real man is a decision maker.
I know you've put a lot more thought into this topic, and that's part of the reason I was interested in doing this podcast with you is I'm kind of behind you in this. I know what I've learned so far in life is that I have been passive as a man in relationships in the past, meaning I deferred a lot to my partner. And that hasn't worked for me. I'm in a much better place now. I'm much more assertive than I ever was in my relationship. And I can say that this relationship is way better than any of the past ones I've had. I had to be careful when I was making that transition not to go into the aggressive piece too far, because sort of like a pendulum, I realized I'd been passive and I swung back a little bit too hard the other way. I think that's the piece that I'm really most conscious of, is being a partner, being assertive, and picking up the pieces when they need to be picked up. Sometimes it's predicting when things are going to fall apart and, thinking ahead. One thing that I admire in people is that resilience. I really have kind of a soft spot for people who have come out of nowhere and made something of themselves, especially people who have had addiction issues and they've turned it around. I've always kind of admired that kind of resilience in men. So for me, it's being a partner in the relationship. One thing I learned, reciprocity doesn't mean that you do half the things and your partner does half the things. Reciprocity is more about knowing when to be there, knowing when to show up in the relationship, and knowing when you don't have to. It's an interdependence. So it's relying on your partner and also being there for your partner. So those are the things that are important to me as a man.
I don't know that my marriage has ever been 50-50. I don't think it's ever worked out that way. And it may, I know, for example, my wife, she's an oncology nurse, and probably one of the hardest things for her was losing both of her parents to cancer within a few years of each other. And knowing, what the diagnoses meant, and knowing what the lab results meant, knowing where that road was leading, was very challenging for her. And I think there were periods then where it was probably more like 70-30. I was probably carrying a heavier load. The flip side of that, over the last few years, I've struggled with some long-term medical issues that have gotten worse. And I've been fortunate. I, for the most part, have been able to go to work and do my job and do as much as I can around the house. But we are not 50-50, right now, especially when it comes to responsibilities, family responsibilities. She's carrying a heavier burden right now. And I think one of the things I've tried to do is to find a way. I know it's not going to be 50-50 right now. And the man part of me doesn't like that. I don't like being reliant on even my wife. I don't like needing her to do things for me that I feel like I should be able to do myself. But I've gotten to the point of acceptance of it. And what I've been trying to do is to find small ways to add a couple of percentage points here and there. And maybe it's because I'm a guy and I don't like being under the 50% mark. I don't know. I don't frankly care. But I think it's because I know that her job is not easy. Her life is not easy. And, here's me, this sort of chronic medical patient who, and thankfully I don't need like 24-hour care. I don't need anything like that, nowhere near. But I need more. And so I want to ease that burden for her as much as I can.
Yeah.
All right. So, Michael, what's your takeaway today?
Oh, my takeaway is, the stuff's complicated. The research that you brought up today kind of blew me away, especially the piece about being vulnerable. Your partner may be saying, I'd really love it if you'd be more emotional, be more vulnerable, and then actually not really liking that. And I think I've seen that play out not only in my own life, but in others. So that's interesting. That's something I wasn't aware of. And the takeaway, I think this podcast is helping us kind of define what it is to be a guy in this day and age. I was talking to my partner earlier about what does she see at work with the younger generation, and she said that actually the male partners in relationships tend to be a little more involved than people of our generation. But she also has said that they're staying single longer, not just men, but women. So a lot of her coworkers are in their 30s and are not even, either they're not in a relationship or they're not married, and they're not thinking about that. So things are changing. And as a 57-year-old, talking about what it means to be a guy in this day and age, because like we talked about in the last podcast, both of us grew up in much more traditional households than we have now. So I think it helps to stay kind of on top of what it means. When we look at studies on culture, when people move from one country to another, the most well-adjusted people are the people who take pieces from both cultures and incorporate those into their lives, not people who go one direction and keep their old culture or go like 100% into the new culture. It's good to have pieces of both to be a well-adjusted person. And I think the same applies for gender.
Agreed. Well, as always, I have thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. Looking forward to next time.
Yeah, this was cool.
All right, man. Take care. We'll talk next time.
Yep, sounds good.